My name is Steve Strauss. I'm a professor in the Department of Forest Science and director of the OSU Outreach and Biotechnology program. Together with Professor Mary Jo Nye, the lecture series co-organizer, it's our pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. This is the third in our year-long series on history, technology, and gastronomy of food and associated agricultural issues. The lecture series is co-sponsored by the Horning Endowment for the Humanities and the OSU Outreach and Biotechnology program, with support from the Waite and Lois Rising Lectureship Fund. We are extremely pleased that Professor Marchant has agreed to come to OSU. I heard him speak in a small conference several years ago that was intended to educate judges and law professors about the legal issues of the new biotechnologies, and was struck with the depth of his scientific comprehension. Are lawyers attuned to science far more deeply than I had imagined possible? I'm afraid not. It turns out that Professor Marchant has a PhD in genetics. He is the Lincoln Professor of Emerging Technologies, Law, and Ethics at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. He is also a professor of life sciences at ASU and executive director of the ASU Center for the Study of Law, Science, and Technology. Professor Marchant has that PhD in genetics from the University of British Columbia and a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and his law degree is from Harvard. I think you will agree that Harvard is probably not a bad place to get an education, and Professor Marchant seems to have made the most of it. In 1990, he graduated first in a class of 540 and was editor of the Harvard Environmental Law Review and the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. Not a bad start to a career. Prior to joining the ASU faculty in 1999, he was a partner in a Washington, D.C. law firm where his practice focused on environmental and administrative law. Since coming to ASU, Professor Marchant has taught and conducted research in an amazing diversity of areas, including risk assessment, FDA drug law, ethics of genetic testing, biotechnology, and nanotechnology. He's written 2 books, published dozens of scholarly journal articles, given numerous invited lectures, and served on 2 National Academy committees. Despite this workload, he must not do a bad job of teaching. This year, he was voted Professor of the Year by students at the ASU School of Law. Tonight, Professor Marchant will discuss the daunting challenges to national and international regulatory systems in trying to control the fast-evolving food biotechnologies. Like nanotechnology, biotechnology represents cutting-edge biological science based on things we cannot see and people hardly understand, but with amazing potentials for good and significant health and environmental risks if misused. The title of his lecture, which I think you can read up there, is The Role and Rule of Law in the Global Development of Food Biotechnology. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Marchant to OSU.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be at OSU tonight at a night when your rival is playing my school's current rival in football tonight. So I feel a common bond here tonight and some agreement before we get into this contentious area where our consensus may break down. And I look forward to a spirited discussion after my presentation. What I want to talk about is first just a brief introduction of GM foods. Many of you already know a lot about this, how I sort of see the benefits, the risks, and what the real concerns are about GM foods. And then talk about the role of law in trying to address these concerns. And I'm going to argue that law is the least worst institution we have to deal with it. I don't think there is a best institution, but it's the least worst. And I'll give you some examples of how the law is trying to muddle through on some difficult, complex issues involving GM foods. And then I want to close by talking about some of the limitations of law and how those might need to be addressed. So we hear a lot of hype about this century being the biotech or the genetic century, and there's a lot of excitement and hope about this technology for a lot of different applications, but there's also all these other issues lurking around, like health risks, environmental risks, social risks, ethical risks, economic risks, uncertainties, equity issues, and public opinion is a huge one. And together those all have created a very messy and difficult problem. But nevertheless, GM foods are generally here. If you look at the U.S. crops, 89% of soybeans grown in the United States last year were genetically modified, 83% of cotton, 61% of corn. So these are many of our largest crops are largely genetically modified at this point. There's a ticker, if you go to this website, truthabouttrade.org, that'll tell you the exact number of acres in the world growing with biotech at this point. And as of this morning, when I last checked, it was 1.624 billion acres of land have been planted with GM crops. Something like over 70% of all processed food contains some, and it's estimated over a trillion meal servings in the United States and Canada have been served containing GM ingredients. So this isn't a hypothetical issue. This is something that's here right now in a very big way, and possibly going to grow even more in the future. There's a lot of benefits that we know that have been documented and studied well by journalists, by USDA and other agencies looking at the effects of biotech in both the United States and in other countries, and have found very clear demonstrated benefits of this technology, including reducing pesticide use of less environmentally harmful herbicides, less tilling of soils, reduced greenhouse gas emissions from less plowing and so on, increased yields, and reduced fumosins or mycotoxins, which are found to be at much higher levels in conventional organic foods, a known carcinogen, than in GM foods, where they're much reduced. So there's a number of benefits that we can clearly measure. These are very objectively measured, and I don't think they can really be disputed. And then looking forward more speculatively, there's all these other technologies and applications we've been told about. Apparently a lot of these are in development, although we haven't seen a lot of them hit the market yet, involving things like more healthy foods, non-allergenic foods for nuts and wheat and so on, even vaccines in food, things like drought and salt-tolerant foods, which would be very important for a lot of developing countries where they're having huge drought problems and a lot of salt in their soils. And so there's a lot more maybe coming on the horizon with, again, huge benefits. I love this op-ed from the New York Times a few years ago talking about some of the things we can look forward to: caffeinated oranges, Viagra peas, personal-sized turkeys, pink bananas. A lot of these maybe aren't that speculative, far off. I mean, apparently Scott's been working on different color lawn grass, and at our university, and I'm sure a lot of others are working on drugs in plants, pharmaceuticals in plants. So who knows what the future will bring in terms of this technology and the benefits. So far, at least, the scientific consensus by the main scientific bodies that have looked at this have not found any unique risks from GM. Doesn't mean there's no risks at all, but compared to any other type of food, they found no increase of risk. So our U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 3 different studies has came to a similar conclusion as this, that crops modified by GM should pose risks no different from those modified by classic genetic methods for similar traits. As you may know, most of our foods have been modified over history by selection, by mutagenesis with chemicals and radiation and other methods. And our U.S. National Academy of Sciences has 3 times concluded there's no reason to suspect or any evidence that these are any more dangerous when we genetically modify them than these other techniques. Very interesting, the European Union, which has put a moratorium for many years on GM foods, their own leading scientific advisory body concluded that the use of more precise technology and a greater regulatory scrutiny probably makes biotech crops even safer than conventional plants and foods. And basically every major scientific body that's looked at this issue has come to that same conclusion, that there may be risks in certain applications of GM foods, but as a whole we have no reason to believe these are any more risky than any other type of food technology. We've had a number of scares of reports initially of there being a problem that have so far all turned out not to be well-founded, that they in fact aren't a significant risk. Although these include like the monarch butterfly, where an initial study suggested it might be killing, the Bt corn might be killing the monarch butterfly. Subsequent studies didn't bear that out and found that to be a minimal or negligible risk. Of course, the first story was on the front pages in New York Times and many publications. You see ads like this, killer pollen. I'm a member of many national environmental organizations. Within 2 weeks, I received letters from 4 or 5 of them saying, this is a new concern, the monarch butterfly. The Union of Concerned Scientists, their logo still is a monarch butterfly that was started because of this. When the subsequent studies didn't find a risk, those were on page A18 of the New York Times, a very small little story. Examples like Starlink and Bayer rice, where basically non-approved GM foods got into our crop systems, also raised health concerns. Those have been studied and not found to be a health risk, but caused huge economic harms. Greenpeace just put a study last week suggesting the Bayer rice example, where some of their some unapproved rice got into various rice streams in the United States, cost about $1.2 billion. And one of the issues to wonder about is it worth losing $1.2 billion in costs over something that didn't cause any harm to human health and the environment? It is basically a regulatory violation, not a health violation. Most recently, there's been stories that GM foods might be responsible for the disappearing bees, and again, those have found not to be well-founded. Despite then the demonstrated benefits, and so far no reason to believe or evidence of any increased risk, GM foods have not been a big success worldwide. There's been strong rejection in the EU particularly, but even in a country like the United States, which is the biggest grower of GM crops, public opinion is pretty divided and mixed on this, maybe 50-50 at best, some polls even showing the majority of Americans not supportive of GM foods. And the reasons for that, I think, go beyond these typical benefits and risks that scientists normally look at to some larger social, ethical issues that drive a lot of the opposition or concerns about GM foods. One of the big ones in Europe was just how these were introduced, that basically they were sort of snuck into the food supply without any really public notification or discussion or approval. Monsanto later admitted they sort of did it wrong of trying to just get it out there, and then after people have been eating it for a number of years saying, see, we told you it's safe, it's nothing to be worried about, people didn't like that. They thought it was sort of sneaky, and that caused a huge resentment and rejection of the technology. Another problem so far is that consumers see no real benefits from the crops we've had so far. They're basically what are called input traits that make the growing of them easier or less expensive or use less pesticides, but they don't have any difference in the product actually coming to consumers. And so since consumers see no benefits from these technologies directly, why should they accept any type of risk? Another issue affecting some is the corporate control, that most of the GM crops we're seeing so far under the control of large corporations, which causes a lot of people to be distrustful and concerned about. Globally, the U.S. dominance in this technology that's growing as Europe is sort of drawing back on this technology, the U.S. lead in this is growing and growing, causes some resentment. And then there's this sort of often called a yuck factor, this sense that GM foods are unnatural. And when I talk to members of my family, that seems to be the real driver of why they feel uncomfortable, that there's something unnatural about GM foods, of messing around with the genome. And of course, we've been messing around for centuries, if not longer, with our different foods, but something about this really bothers a significant number of people. And so all of these factors combined and individually have really restrained the growth of GM foods and the development of it. We also have an organized opposition to it and some very strong statements. Greenpeace saying potentially the biological pollution from GMOs is far more dangerous than even nuclear chemical pollution. Jeremy Rifkin, a well-known critic of GM foods, says they threaten a form of annihilation every bit as deadly as nuclear holocaust. Pretty strong words about this technology. And so we have a lot of difference of opinion and opposition to this technology. George McGovern, who is the Democratic president nominee, as you know, in 1972, he spent a number of years being the U.S. delegate to the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. He recently wrote an op-ed saying, the most promising weapon in the global war against world hunger is high-yielding scientific agriculture, including genetically modified crops. And yet the gene modification controversy and trumped-up fears of frankenfoods are stepping on the promise of a hungry-free future. I shuddered recently when I read that a prosperous chef of a chic Manhattan restaurant denounced this new life-saving technology. How could we have come to this? So there's this dilemma of where are we on this issue, and how has it become so controversial and so divisive? And I think when you dig into this, you see there's a number of subsidiary issues that are very controversial, that we don't have great answers to and consensus on. Are GM crops safe? More importantly, what types of safety data should be required before we can market these and can be assured they're safe? Should GM foods be labeled? Should nations be able to restrict GM imports, and if so, under what conditions? For what types of harm and based on what evidence should people be compensated for harms from GM foods? And should genes and GM organisms be patentable? These are all huge controversies that we don't have any consensus on in society, and it's a controversy over those that drives the larger issue. And the question I want to ask you is, how do we decide these issues as a society? Given we have different points of view and opinions on these issues, how do we decide these? And we have a number of institutions we could rely on. Religion has traditionally been how we deal with a lot of these controversial issues over time. Today, our religious views are more fragmented. It's still an important factor, but it's not going to decide the issue for us. Social values and norms are also important, but they're still not going to be strong enough to decide the issue. Market forces are playing a role now, and they'll continue to be important. But again, the market alone, I don't think, can answer these questions. Industry could self-regulate. There's self-regulation programs. They're useful to do, but again, on their own, I don't think they're sufficient. Scientists can use ethical principles to sort of do just good stuff. Again, an important contribution, but I don't think it's going to rule the day. So I think what we're left with a lot is law, is going to be our decisive technology or institution to decide these issues. And almost by default, this is who is going to have to decide these issues, and in fact is deciding them now. And so what I want to talk about is, how does law do this? And how effective is law in addressing these kind of issues? When you look generally, there's been ever since the founding of our country, a sense that law is sort of sometimes our last resort to decide these issues. Alex de Tocqueville, who was one of the real, initial commentators on the American experiment a couple hundred years ago, he wrote, "Scarcely any political question arises in the United States that is not resolved sooner or later into a judicial question." Judge Howard Markey, who is the first chief judge of the Federal Court of Appeals in D.C., wrote, "Law is the only tool that society has to tame and channel science and technology." Joseph Campbell, the famous writer on myths, wrote that lawyers and law are what hold us together. There is no ethos. And Daniel Callahan, who admits he hates lawyers and law, says, unfortunately, we're in an era of legalism, that we just can't decide issues if we don't make them legal. And by not making them illegal, we're saying it's okay. And so therefore, we have no consequence other than, or no choice other than to make things, use law as our primary tool. So we have this thing called the rule of law. New York Times recently said, "The rule of law, whether applied to matters trivial or grand, is the central magic of the American governmental experience." And Pierre Schlegel, who then went on to criticize this idea of the rule of law, defined it as power, interest, prejudice, and personal proclivities are constrained and controlled by the overarching frame known as the rule of law. And you've seen this picture of the justice being blind. It means it's not supposed to be affected by biases, prejudice, interests, and so on. Of course, it never attains that ideal, but it maybe tries to do a good enough job that it can decide some of these issues for us. And so, again, by default, we're relying on the law to decide the type of questions I've been talking about, given the lack of any other institution to do that. And in looking at law, we really have three forms of law in the United States. We have legislation adopted by U.S. Congress and our state legislatures. We have regulations adopted by regulatory agencies, again, both the federal and state level. And then we have court decisions. And all of those are different types of law. And we can look quickly at some examples of how these different institutions have tried to address these difficult issues of GM foods. We can start with legislation. This is the easiest slide I've ever had to write. There is no legislation. Congress has been looking at this issue for over 20 years and has done absolutely nothing. There's no changes in our laws whatsoever. So they basically completely failed to address these issues and resolve these issues. Maybe they're the most appropriate body to do so, but they have so many other things on their plate. They have gridlock and differences of view on this issue, and so they basically completely punted. They have not at all changed or updated our laws to deal with GM foods. So we're left with regulatory agencies. This is an actual headline from Science magazine a number of years ago. Biotech companies lobby for federal regulation. You don't normally think of companies wanting regulation, but this story says there's several reasons why companies are actually advocating the federal government to get off its butt and to actually start regulating this technology. First of all, in order to get investment, you need to know what kind of requirements are going to be required of this technology in the longer term, and so they want to know what the regulations are, given that at some point regulation is going to be inevitable. The industries want to stave off state-by-state regulatory patchworks of different regulations. It'd be better to have federal regulation in their view. They think that regulations will build public confidence. that government affirmation of safety would be useful for defending against liability and would create a minimum floor of requirements to protect against sort of these wild risk takers who would bring down the entire industry if they do something stupid and the entire industry gets tagged with these irresponsible acts. So it's kind of interesting, as the biotech era started, one of the first groups asking for regulation is the biotech industry. It'd be interesting to go back to them now and ask, so how do you like it so far? Do you agree it's a good idea? But so in response to these and other pressures in the 80s, as we started to develop and field test our first genetically modified foods, there was a lot of discussion and debate of how we should regulate these things. Should we get new statutes, new regulations? How should we go about doing this? And the U.S. government decided in 1986 to publish a thing called the Coordinated Framework for the Regulation of Biotech Products. And the key thing about this framework was that we're not going to adopt new laws, we're not going to adopt new regulations, we're just going to adapt our existing regulations administered by over 6 different agencies and just apply them to this brand new technology, apply old law to new problems. As we'll see in a few minutes, there's problems with that, but it had the benefit of being able to put in place regulation quite quickly. And so as they explained in adopting this, the existing health and safety laws have the advantage that they could provide more immediate regulatory protection and certainty for the industry than possible with the implementation of new legislation. Moreover, there did not appear to be an alternative unitary statutory approach, since the very broad spectrum of products obtained with genetic engineering cut across many product uses regulated by different agencies. And one of the key philosophies in the coordinated frameworks was citing to the National Academy of Sciences same opinion on this, is that we should focus on the product, not the process. And the rhetoric of the U.S. government agencies is they say that we don't treat GM foods differently than other conventional foods. We agree with the National Academy of Sciences, has repeatedly said that you should look at the individual products. Some individual products might be risky, others not. You can't make a generic across-the-board sweeping statement that GM foods are more risky than others. And that was the philosophy underlying the coordinated framework. I don't think it's been achieved, even though our regulatory agencies still say that. They, in fact, do treat GM foods differently than any other food in the United States. Basically, all other foods aren't regulated at all, and there is some regulation of GM foods. People differ on whether it's too much or too little. So the coordinated framework has been in place now for over 20 years, and there's different points of view on how well it's worked. Basically, the GM food issue has not been as controversial in the United States as it has in other parts of the world, so to that extent it's worked well. There have been other criticisms of it, though. One of the problems is that agencies basically have to stretch their current laws to reach GM, and some of those stretching of laws make the agencies legally vulnerable, and it's argued they're not being as aggressive or strong because they're uncertain about their legal extensions of these existing regulations. For example, when the USDA regulates biotech crops, there's no regulatory authority for this, so what they do is they say, we consider all GM foods to be plant pests. They don't say that for any other type of food, and so they're not treating GM foods the same. They're saying as an entire category, we're going to treat every GM food as a plant pest. Many of them aren't plant pests, but they're just assuming that they are to get them under this regulatory structure. But if that was ever challenged, they may be vulnerable in court. And so the argument of environmental groups and other opponents is that because they're on this shaky legal ground, they won't be as strong as they should be. We have gaps and overlaps. Whenever you take a whole matrix of different existing statutes and apply them to this technology, you're going to have gaps where you're not addressing this at all, and other times where you're going to have overlaps where too many people are addressing the same problem. Examples include plant-based pharmaceuticals that wasn't really considered in the coordinated framework, GM animals, we still don't really have any regulations in place, adventitious presence of GM foods, pollen getting out into other plants. None of the existing statutes regulate that really, and so we're basically don't have regulations in place. Other times you get these strange inconsistencies. So for example, a herbicide-resistant crop and a pesticide-resistant crop, looking at this from sort of a lay perspective, I don't see any reason why they're any different, and yet one's regulated much more stringently than the other, the pesticide-resistant crop, because it triggers an EPA-administered statute FIFRA where the other one doesn't. And it causes all these additional regulatory requirements to come, even though I would assume that the two plants are roughly the same risk factors. One gets regulated much more stringently than the other. So as we talk about this regulation system, there's a number of sort of key issues that to me make this so complex. One is that unlike things like chemical releases or even nuclear releases where you release a finite amount of some material and it gradually dissipates, genetically modified organisms are living and could potentially reproduce and grow, which causes the consequence of a mistake to be much higher than for other types of releases. In addition, given the statistics I showed you early on of how many people are exposed to it and how large of acres of land we're using, if there was a serious problem, it could be pretty significant given the large exposure. Another huge issue in this area is the role of public opinion. A large percentage of the public, as I mentioned before, has these concerns about GM foods. It's generally not shared in the scientific community. What should we base our regulations on? What the scientists tell us or what the public tells us? How do we address those two different perspectives? How do we deal with uncertainties? Because we never really regulated food safety very seriously before in this country, we don't have methods to do toxicity tests as well as we do for, say, a pharmaceutical or a chemical. You know, we test a pharmaceutical or chemical by giving, you know, a millionfold dose to a rat or mouse. We can't give, you know, a rat or a mouse, you know, 10,000 tomatoes and eat them a day. That just doesn't work for food. And so we don't have the same models we do for other materials that we've regulated for many years. This is new to regulate GM foods, to regulate any kind of food. And we're sort of picking GM foods to regulate specifically, again, given showing that this you know, product not process isn't really being applied in principle. But how do we deal with the risk? We don't know how to study the spread of this in the environment and so on. We don't really have any methods to do this. We've never really looked at the spread of pollen before for other foods. How do we actually do this? So we have huge uncertainties, and how do you deal with uncertainties? There's also an issue going the other way of regulatory burdens and fairness, that the burdens we're putting onto GM crops are pretty substantial compared to any other food. You know, sometimes the cost of the regulations alone is in the range of $20 to $50 million per crop. That's in addition to what any other food has cost to develop. And so we're handicapping the GM foods by putting $20 to $50 million of extra regulatory costs on these foods compared to any other food. Is that a fair thing to do, to handicap them in some way? This is an article that Alan Mahugan did in his book showing in Canada two herbicide-resistant crops. One created with nuclear radiation, which also causes mutations elsewhere on the chromosomes, and one more precisely with genetic modification. They have the same phenotype, the same trait. To get the herbicide one made by mutagenesis approved required just a short letter. In the United States, you wouldn't even have to do that. It took a 6-foot pile of studies and, you know, $20 to $50 million of studies to get the GM one approved, even though they have the same phenotype, and arguably the mutagenesis ones has even more unknown mutations than the genetically modified one. So why do we apply such a different standard to GM foods as we do to foods altered by other mechanisms? To me, is a huge overriding issue here. So let me then turn, given those sort of general introduction, to some examples then of how our legal institutions have dealt with this. Again, you know, legislation is done. One of the big issues, probably the biggest issues for our regulatory agencies right now is, should we label GM foods? It's the main sort of demand of the anti-GM organizations in this country. Is sort of their initial step they'd like to see done is to have mandatory labeling of all GM foods. A number of other countries, including the EU, Japan, and Korea, require GM labeling. The legal standard for FDA, which would be the agency who would have the authority to do this, is that they're allowed to require a label if the changes or the differences that you require the labeling for are material and accurate, or the legal terms. And their general policy on food labeling that extends beyond GM but to any kind of foods is that consumers must be informed by appropriate labeling if a food derived from a new plant variety differs from its traditional counterpart. So this applies to any kind of food, including GM, such as the common or usual name no longer applies to new food. That's not going to usually apply here. Or if safety or usage issue exists to which consumers must be alerted. So the key phrase is, does a safety or usage issue exist to which consumers must be alerted? Unless FDA can show that, they're not allowed to require a label under their existing authority. Well, there's a number of arguments in favor of GM labeling. It sort of seems at first impression, at least, to be pretty much a slam dunk. Most people want GM labeling. And when you ask people, do you want GM foods labeled, they'll say yes. Very high percentage, depending on the poll, anywhere from 80 to 95% of the public. For example, the ABC News poll, 93% said they did. And moreover, beyond sort of public opinion, isn't there a right for us to know what's in our food if that's what we want? In addition, from a business perspective, it's kind of bizarre for biotech companies to say this is this wonderful new product, and yet we don't want to tell you it's there or not. We want to keep that quiet. And so Business Week wrote an editorial a couple years ago, GM Foods Why Fight Labeling? By blocking grassroots attempts to put advisory labels on food, the food and biotech industries look as if they have something to hide. So when you consider these arguments, it seems pretty obvious we should require GM labeling. But when you dig into it deeper, it's not quite so simple. There's a lot of complexities here. One is, first of all, what do we mean by a GM food? So for example, the Europeans, which happen to have a lot of economic success in using GM enzymes to make foods like wines and cheese and breads, exclude any use of GM enzymes in a contained use from the labeling requirement. They still involve genetic modification, but it's genetic modification of the bacteria used to make the food. And so they exclude that, but other people say that should be included. Do you include that or do you not? Do you include pork chops from a pig that ate GM corn? Right now, the EU does not require that to be labeled. The environmental groups in Europe say that it should be labeled. The bill that would have been proposed here by Congressman Kucinich would require that. What about the pork chop from the pig whose mother ate GM corn? Again, none of the bills address that. So where you draw the line is not quite so simple, what gets applied. In addition, actually putting on label on some foods becomes difficult. Things like street vendors, things like individual fruits. Do you want another sticker on your apple? Do you want the little vendor selling a hot dog on the street to have a label on their hot dog they hand to you? So how do you actually do that becomes kind of complicated. In addition, we can probably never have absolute certainty whether there's GM ingredients there or not. Every jurisdiction that's adopted GM labeling so far puts a threshold in. One of the problems is they're different. Different parts of the world have different thresholds, what amount of GM contaminant you're allowed in there without putting the label. The legislation introduced by Representative Kucinich would have a 0 threshold, which most people think is just completely unenforceable, especially when you consider that our regulations allow 1 to 7% of foreign material, including insects, rodent droppings, et cetera, in grains, just because we can't get down to that 0% level. How do we segregate this? Our whole food supply system is not built to have 2 different strains for GM and non-GM. It would be quite expensive to duplicate that system. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal recently tested a number of foods that were labeled non-GM and actually found GM in 11 of the 20 samples. So actually verifying this would be kind of difficult, especially because at least the existing crops actually don't really have DNA or protein in the final product. And that's what's changed by genetic modification. They're made from oils and from sugars and so on, which aren't genetically modified. So you can't chemically test the final product on the market, on the supermarket shelves, and tell if it was genetically modified or not. So how do you actually enforce that? In Europe, what they're doing is their traceability requirement, where you have to trace every ingredient in a food product all the way back to the farm, which is enormously expensive, and it's unsure how well that will actually work in Europe. There's also an issue that under our Constitution, both courts and FDA have concluded you can't require labeling unless you can show an increased risk. So a case coming out of Wisconsin involving bovine somatotrophin in milk said it would be misbranding to label a product as different, even if consumers misperceive the product as different. And the Second Circuit, again on the same issue of BST milk, said consumer curiosity alone is not a strong enough state interest to sustain the compulsion of even an accurate factual statement. And these are decisions based not on statute, but on the Constitution, that under free speech rights, you can't require a label unless you can show an important public interest such as a safety problem. And unless the FDA can show that, they aren't allowed under our Constitution, according to these courts, every court that's considered it so far, to actually require a label. So it's not even clear you could legally require it unless you can make this finding of an increased risk, which again, no one's been able to find, at least in a scientific body. In addition, there's a question of what is the purpose of this? I mean, the rhetoric of the GM labeling is to give people the choice. So you can decide whether they want to eat GM foods or not. It's hard to argue against that, but the reality is every place that has implemented GM labeling has actually resulted in no choice. The same organizations that ask for the labeling then go after the food suppliers and protest them until they agree not to provide GM labels. So when you go to the UK, you can't buy GM foods if you want to. And Greenpeace, the leader of their campaign, said if consumers start buying it and get used to it, we will lose. We have to stop it before it gets into the consumers so they can't choose to buy the GM foods. So the idea of choice actually doesn't work if you're going to require labeling. If you have labeling for non-GM, you might get a choice, but with mandatory labeling, you don't get a choice. And then finally, there's the fairness issue. I mean, why are we picking on this one technology when there's, many things are genetically modified? One recent study found there's only 4 U.S. crops that are actually naturally occurring North American species. The blueberry, strawberry, sunflower, squash, everything else didn't exist in nature. These are all created from hundreds of years of human intervention. So why are we picking out this one technology to label? Why not require labeling for other things like pesticide use? In fact, public opinion is even stronger to label pesticide use, which goes down with GM than with GM. So all these issues together take what seems to be a very simple issues for regulatory agencies and actually make it very complicated and very controversial. And finally, do consumers really want this? I mean, you saw this firsthand in Oregon of having the first state referendum on this that failed. And in fact, people voted against that, and there's, I know, a lot of other issues come up within that. But if you also ask people generally, what do you want on the label, they don't say GM. Less than 1 to 2% of the population actually identifies it. If you say, do you want GM on the label, they'll say yes. But if you say, what do you want on the label, they don't identify GM. So the question is, how strong is that point of view? In addition, if I was to ask all of you, would you like a Cadillac, you'd all put up your hands and say, sure. If I say, would you like to pay for that Cadillac, very few of you would want to buy the Cadillac. And so when the Center for Science and the Public Interest, a generally anti-GM organization, actually went and asked people, how much would you pay for labeling? The majority said less than, 61% said less than $10 per year or less. Well, it would cost much, much more than that to actually require this. So in fact, most people don't want to pay for this. And if we go with the majority opinion, then the majority opinion is we don't want to do this. So the public opinion issue isn't quite as clear again as it's made out to be. So when you put this all together, it's a very complex issue. The FDA has come to the decision not to require mandatory labeling of GM crops unless there's a substantial difference in composition, nutritional value, or safety. And this has gone up to the courts, and the courts have upheld that decision, saying, given these facts, the FDA lacks a basis, says it's not only doesn't have to, but can't require labeling, given the facts as the FDA has found them. So again, showing what seems to be a simple issue for agencies to decide is actually very complicated, very controversial, with strong arguments on either side. Let's shift into looking at biotechnology in the courts. By default, our courts are becoming our main institution for deciding a lot of these issues, and there's literally dozens and dozens of cases. I teach an entire semester course on biotechnology in the courts. Let me pick just 3 examples of decisions showing, again, how complex and controversial these decisions are. The first one is, can you patent a living organism? For many years, the Patent and Trademark Office says you can't patent living things. And then in 1980, the Supreme Court, in a close 5-4 decision, said that there's no difference between living and non-living organisms, that the patent law is intended to cover everything under the sun made by man, and as long as it's created by man, modified by man, made different than in nature, the relevant distinction is not between living and inanimate things, but between products of nature, whether living or not, and human-made inventions. So this opened the floodgates to be able to patent not only organisms, including plants initially, but now all kinds of mice, genetically modified mice and other animals, and now genes as well, and human genes, and several thousand human genes have now been patented. Again, a very controversial issue. It raised a lot of ethical, moral issues that a number of groups brought concerns about, and they brought those to the Supreme Court in amicus briefs, and the Supreme Court says we can't consider those. Those are off bounds. We are without competence to entertain these arguments. The choice we urged is a matter of high policy resolution within the legislature, and of course Congress has been silent on this. Go talk to them. They're not things we can decide. So the institution that had to decide this issue for our whole country said, don't talk to us about ethics and morality, that's off bounds. And again, that's a very controversial, problematic way to decide these issues, which I want to come back to later. A second example of a more recent case is one decided earlier this year having to do with genetic pollen drift. And this is a case where the USDA basically allows field testing of genetically modified crops, and then before it's allowed to have them commercialized, it has to deregulate them. And one of the problems is when it deregulates them, it sort of loses all regulatory authority. But that's the way the statute sort of works. Again, it's not a statute that's really written for GM foods. It's not really works very well for it. But anyhow, before they deregulate it, they have to do comply with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, to do an environmental impact statement. And the way NEPA works is you first do a shorter study called an environmental assessment to determine if there's any significant risks. And if you conclude there isn't, you go forward with the decision. If you conclude there is, you do this much longer 2-year study called an environmental impact statement. And USDA has to do this anytime they deregulate a GM crop. When they did this for Roundup Ready alfalfa, they concluded after the environmental assessment that there was no significant impact on the environment. And the court held that that wasn't good enough, that they failed to adequately assess the risk that insect pollination could result in what the court termed biological contamination of nearby organic and seed production alfalfa crops. It's generally regarded that alfalfa pollen is fertilized using bees, and that these bees can spread the pollen for a couple miles, up to a couple miles, and that nearby organic farms and non-GM farms could have, therefore, their crops pollinated by the GM crops, and that's a form of biological contamination that is a significant risk, according to the court, and basically blocked not only the APHIS approval, but any further planting by farmers of these crops based on this theory. The USDA argument was that the risk of contamination was relatively small. Most of the alfalfa is grown for hay or forage before there's seeds, that under the USDA regulations, it's the obligation of the organic farmers to establish a buffer zone, something that caused the organic farmers to be outraged to say that we have to be the ones to deal with this problem when you're growing your crops. And moreover, that the consequences of contamination, according to the USDA, were not significant. There's no health or environmental traits, they asserted. Many existing weed species have herbicide resistance already. Organic standards are not violated if the organic crops contain small amount of GM contamination. The USDA is the one to certify organic crops, and they say we've never decertified organic foods if it has a little bit of contamination. Now, there could still be market consequences for organic food farmers if their contract requires no GM, but under the USDA regulations, there is no problem, according to USDA. And that importing countries like Japan have GM thresholds of 1% or higher, not likely to be exceeded. But despite these arguments, the court said we reject the USDA arguments. They accepted the agency's determination that Roundup Ready alfalfa does not have any harmful effects on humans or livestock. Nevertheless, the court concluded the potential for contamination of these organic and conventional alpha crops growing nearby is, in the court's opinion, irreparable environmental harm. The contamination cannot be undone. It will destroy the crops of these farmers who do not sell genetically engineered alfalfa. And then goes on to say that the government's apparent belief that the farmers' and consumers' choice is irrational because the engineered gene is similar is beside the point. So this is a very complex, controversial decision. From the perspective of organic farmers, they've made a deliberate decision to grow non-GM crops, and because of something their neighbors are doing, they now are precluded from that opportunity if there's going to be contamination. From the perspective of the biotech companies and the farmers, they would argue that all these plants are sharing pollen all the time, that there's no additional risk from our pollen. The organic plants are contaminating our plants as much as the GM are contaminating the organic, and that we're spending billions of dollars on something that has no environmental or health consequence. And both sides, I think, have a perspective there that has some legitimacy, and it's basically two colliding arguments here and how we decide these. And the court in this case upheld the argument of the organic food farmers. A third recent case is going beyond national law and looking at international courts, and this has to do with the moratorium put on GMs by the European Union after the monarch butterfly incident. And even though the data later showed that wasn't a problem, they continued their moratorium for a number of years, finally removing it last year. And the U.S. brought a WTO, World Trade Organization, trade case against the EU, and basically concluded that this was not supported by scientific risk assessment and complied with international trade law. And the World Trade Organization decision came down last year in favor of the United States, saying that the EU could not continue to delay approving GM crops. They didn't say the EU system is illegal, just that the way they're implementing it is illegal because they're not approving these applications on a timely basis. And moreover, the bans put in place by various countries based on the precautionary principle are illegal under international law. And in this case, the EU sort of didn't apply very good lawyering in a lot of ways. They sort of really shot themselves in the foot. The EU Environmental Commissioner at the time criticized her government's, the EU's own moratorium and says this is an illegal, illogical, and otherwise arbitrary line in the sand. And so when you have the head minister of the EU actually saying that what they're doing is illegal, it's pretty hard to defend that in international court to say that what you're doing doing is legal when you've got that admission. Again, the EU's own scientific committee had looked at every one of the 25 GM products and concluded no risks. And the Commissioner for Health and Consumer Affairs said that the EU's official position was that currently marketed GM crops presented no greater risk than the corresponding conventional food varieties. So then to go and try and justify why are you banning these in international law was doomed to failure. These were all attachments to the U.S. Thing. What was interesting is that one of the first times this thing decided the legal status of the precautionary principle, so there's been no authoritative decision to date whether this is a principle of customary law, but it does not provide an independent basis for a decision that permits dispensing with science-based risk assessment. So the EU lost that case, and in fact the deadline for them to comply with it is later this month, and it's not clear whether all the EU Commission is trying to comply, but some of the individual countries are saying they're not going to comply. And so we have a potential breakdown in international trade law over this decision. So all of these decisions are very controversial. There's strong arguments on either side of them. The court systems are trying to work their way through and resolve them because of almost by default, no one else is deciding them. So looking then generally of how our legal system deals with this, let me go through just what I see are sort of four real limitations of the legal system. One is a technological imperative. As we have this capability to make all these modifications and so on, will we have the capability to actually say no? Have we ever been able to say this is some place we shouldn't go and draw lines in the sand and say, you know, we don't want to cross this line? Because surely there are some potential applications of GM that any or all of us might oppose. So can we have this capability to say no? Because I think we need to have that to be able to go forward successfully with the technology. And we've never been able to really demonstrate this. The New York Times said gene splicing, artificial insemination, IVF, bovine, all these were these brave new worlds. We had all this agonizing, but the scientists kept quietly, deliberately working away, incrementally improving the technology. What seemed scary to people slowly started to seem interesting, maybe useful looking back over the years. It's hard to find a case in which the unthinkable remains unthinkable for long. So are we stuck with technological determinism? We're just going to go through these cycles again and again, and we can't say no to anything. To me, to go forward with these technologies, we're going to need to develop the ability to say no. There's problems with trying to legislate morality. We've had all kinds of problems, for example, trying to ban cloning, where basically states made it illegal to create a genetically identical persons, making it a criminal offense to have identical twins, because they didn't think of how this law would actually be applied in actuality. There's also an argument by a lot of legal scholars, never tested in the courts, that banning any type of research would be unconstitutional, that research is a type of First Amendment protection of expressive conduct. And so there's a real question, can we actually ban some types of research? So that's a huge issue that I think has to be resolved. Can we show the political will and the legal ability to say no to certain technologies so we can go forward with things we want to and be able to stop things we can't? A second major problem is the technological literacy of legal decision makers. I'll take a judge's own words. Substantive review of mathematical and scientific evidence by technically illiterate judges is dangerously unreliable. These were some of the nation's leading judges in the DC Circuit who said this. If you look at Congress doesn't have very good technical sophistication either. Most of them are not scientists. I won't proclaim what Mark Twain said, but what he said is, suppose you were an idiot and suppose you're a member of Congress, but I repeat myself, very critical of that. And we've had all kinds of examples of crazy legal decisions. A number of years ago, over 100 years ago, the Indiana House decided they didn't want their kids to have to remember that pi equals 3.14 whatever, so they legislated that pi equals 3. You wouldn't want to buy anything made in the state of Indiana based on that law. T.D. Lysenko, who was Stalin's agricultural minister, basically said classical genetics is all bourgeois and imposed a different form of genetics that turned out to be a complete failure and contributed to the crop failures that resulted in 20 million deaths. Juries awarded in Philadelphia $1 million to a psychic whose psychic abilities were destroyed by a CAT scan. Why she didn't predict that would happen is an open question, but the fact that a jury would give her $1 million verdict suggests, do we really trust our courts to make informed decisions in this? And there's a number of examples in the GM area. Mendocino County in California was the first to prohibit the growing of genetically modified foods, and their ordinance defined DNA as a complex protein that is present in every cell of an organism. And this went through several levels of review, and this became the law in Mendocino County that DNA is a protein. Of course, DNA is not a protein. And so this very simple fact they just got wrong in this law they enacted. Another GM example in the case I mentioned in the alfalfa, the judge ordered as a remedy that all hay has to be put in a container with a label on it. And they had to go back to the court and explain to the judge that hay is actually sold in a container, sold in bales. And they said, oh, okay, I didn't understand that. So you don't have to put a label on it after all. So, these don't give us a lot of confidence. I love this proposal that New Mexico tried. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed it after both houses passed it, and they're talking about psychological evidence that when a psychologist or psychiatrist testifies during a competency hearing, the psychiatrist or psychiatrist shall wear a cone-shaped hat that is not less than 2 feet tall. The surface of this hat shall be printed with stars and lightning bolts. Additionally, the psychologist or psychiatrist shall be required to don a white beard and shall punctuate crucial elements of his testimony by stabbing the air with a wand. So this could have been a solution, but unfortunately the governor vetoed it. But so we have seriously a problem of the legal decision makers being able to understand these issues. A third big problem is, can we keep up with these technologies that are moving so fast? You've heard maybe of Moore's law, that the power of computers doubles every 18 months. There's Monsanto's law, same thing for genetic information doubling. So the science and the technology is moving at an incredibly fast pace on an exponential curve. We don't really think exponential, we think linearly. Ray Kurzweil says that we will basically experience not 100 years of progress, but more like 20,000 years of progress, because we're on an exponential rate. That's sort of like compounding interest. And we're moving faster and faster into science and technology. At the same time, our legal institutions have never been slower. So Congress is just absolutely burned down with so many issues they have to deal with, like flag burning and so on, that they have to spend their time on. And they don't have time to get to all these other issues facing the country. If you look at examples like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Act was adopted 30-something years ago, and it was primarily to deal with what are called point sources of pollution. That's now the very small percentage of all water pollution. Most water pollution today is non-point, and the statute effectively doesn't regulate it at all. And we've known this for 20 years, that it's completely obsolete, that we are missing the major part of water pollution now is basically going unregulated, but Congress has never got around to updating it yet, even today. And so it's incredibly slow to act to these problems. Regulatory agencies are what legal scholars now call ossification. They're just being ground down and slowed down with all these requirements. They have to do something like 20 different analysis that different statutes now require them to do in addition to the actual rulemaking. That many major rulemakings now take 10 years or longer to actually put up a single regulation. And then courts can take a decade to come to a final decision. In the recent Windows 98 antitrust litigation, the court started its opinion in 2003 saying, what are we doing talking about the antitrust violations of 1998 Windows? We're already 2 generations past this. This is ancient history, and we're just getting to this issue now. We just can't keep up with technology. We're basically deciding obsolete cases of the past instead of the cases today. So there's this real problem of how can the legal system catch up. It was interesting, one of the major officials of Intel recently testified to Congress in the context of nanotech, talking about GMOs. What we need to follow, what we need to avoid for the trajectory of nanotechnology is to avoid following that of genetically modified organisms, the most recent magic technology. In the case of GMOs, deployment of applications outpace attention to the environmental health and safety implications of the technology. Public concerns that arose because of this have significantly retarded the realizations of GMOs' great commercial potential. So it's interesting that people in other technologies are pointing to GMOs as an example where the law just hasn't kept up. And it hasn't. If you look at how I mentioned how USDA regulates GM foods, it's by this contrived forcing of it trying to get into the plant pest category, because that's the only regulatory authority they have. But the problem is when they then allow something to be commercialized, they lose any further regulatory oversight, which just doesn't make sense to have no oversight once the product gets approved. And so it's just an obsolete statute that Congress hasn't updated. A recent story this summer in the U.S. New York Times about genetically modified animals, that quoting both the supporters of the technology, like this should be UC Davis, the professor who's developed some of these, saying right now it's very hard to get any corporate investment because what studies do you need to do? What are the FDA looking for? There's stuff's not there. There's just no regulatory oversight yet. And a critic of the technology says the same thing. The fact that the agency has sat there for years staring this problem in the face and really hasn't come up with a clear way to regulate, that's abdicating its responsibilities. That law just isn't being able to keep up with this technology. And so this is another huge issue. And of course, Congress done nothing. So another easy slide to do. Finally, and maybe the most significant, is the legal irrelevancy of social and ethical concerns. As I mentioned before, many of the concerns people have aren't so much the scientific issues of does it kill the monarch butterfly, which it doesn't appear to do, but these broader sort of yuck factor of the social, ethical, political, economic concerns about the technology. And yet most of our regulatory decision making is basically rule this out of bounds. The agencies aren't even allowed to consider this. I mentioned the example of the patents. In Europe, they do have this clause called the Ord Public Clause that allows the agency to consider the morality of the invention and whether to give a patent. But our Patent and Trademark Office and our U.S. Supreme Court says you're not allowed to consider that in the United States. If it's unethical, patent law doesn't have any say on that. It's irrelevant, and so you can't consider the morality. When, for example, the FDA had a recent proceeding on whether meat and milk from cloned animals should be allowed to be sold. Thousands of people submitted comments that were mostly focused on some of the ethical and social objections they had. And the FDA's response is, we don't have jurisdiction to consider that. We consider whether it's safe, whether it's effective. That's all Congress allows us to do. We can't, again, consider what you care about, what these ethical positions. Even though these polls by the Pew show that most Americans do care primarily about the moral issues. That's what's concerned about them. Same with GM food, that's really these underlying concerns. So we have a problem. I mean, why do we not consider these ethical? I mean, there's some arguments for this that unlike things like, does it cause cancer, does it kill butterflies, it's hard to come to consensus on what moral issues are. We differ sometimes on those, so it's harder to regulate. They're more intangible, harder to justify. It's harder sometimes to justify government interventions, and more importantly, regulatory agencies don't have any expertise in this. They don't have ethicists to consider the ethical argument and social issues. So we'd have to restock our agencies. But even with that, I think it's problematic in a democracy that the things most people care about, whether you agree with them or not, they should at least be vented and have an opportunity to be discussed. And yet most of our statutes simply rule this out of bounds. So my basic conclusion is that law isn't perfect. It needs a lot of work, but it might be the best thing we have, or the least worst we have. And therefore, an important project, one of the things I do a lot of work in, is trying to find ways to make law, being able to address these issues more effectively. And I'll just conclude with this last cartoon and ask you, do you feel happy about this? That the best thing about a change information age to biotechnologies, we lawyers are still in charge. Does that make you feel happy or not? And I'd be glad to take your criticisms, comments, and questions. I guess because of the size of the audience, it's going to be hard to get a microphone to you. So what I'll do is I'll repeat the question back. So I'd appreciate if you can make it as succinct as you can. Yes, sir.
I take your general message to be a plea for greater sympathy from us, from the public, with respect to the biotech agricultural companies. That they need some help from the public in order to be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And they're not getting the proper help from the agencies, the government, and so on. So you're appealing to the public to help them out.
So the question is my argument that...
I haven't asked my question.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Now, in view of this, plea for sympathy, I want to raise the question, how sympathetic are these large corporations toward us? You're asking us to sympathize with them and help them out. How are they helping us out? Or are they actually ruthlessly concerned with profits and racing along as fast as they can with regard to any invention that they may discover?
Okay, so the question is, first of all, am I saying that we should be sympathetic and more sympathetic to the biotech companies, and then the reverse is, are they sympathetic to us as they race for profits and so on? Are they being responsive to us? Well, first of all, that's not what my message is. My message is that we have these very complex issues to decide as a society. How do we go about deciding them? And to me, the only institution we really have deciding these is law, which is doing, I think everybody who has a strong position on these disagrees with some cases and agrees with others. So maybe that's good. It's laws going right down the middle, making everybody mad. I don't know. But, I think it's trying its best to do it, but I think there's some real problems in how we decide these. So my plea is not sympathy for the companies, but let's find other ways to do things like address the ethical concerns that companies are not really that interested in, to find ways to give them some legal validity and legal currency so they can be considered. Finally, I just say about companies, I mean, one of the problems with our regulatory system is that it's so expensive now to develop a GM crop, the only people who can do it is large corporations. So one of the costs of ramping up regulation is you squeeze out the universities, the nonprofits, the public research institutes from ever being able to develop GM crops, including ones where I think the greatest need for them is in developing countries. If it's, profitable companies are not going to have an economic interest to develop those are where I think we need the greatest development. And basically we're squeezing those out if we over-regulate this technology. So I think we have to balance safety and concerns against, not impeding good developments by non-corporate, non-profit-driven interests. Other comments? Yes.
So you said that we can't put a label on GM foods if we can't find the safety problems. But since there are no labels on GM foods, there's essentially no traceability. If I get sick, I can't say, oh, it must have been the GM corn and everything. I can't, there could be hundreds or millions of people who are getting food allergies, who are getting sick that there's just no, I can't bring that case to the company. And essentially I can't get that label put on because that safety concern hasn't been.
Yeah, so the question is, is it another argument essentially for GM labeling, is it would allow us to study whether these things are dangerous or not, and sort of like catch-22, if you can't have the label unless there's a risk, you'll never find out if there's a risk unless you have the label to be able to treat it back. The problem with that argument is that every place that has adopted a label doesn't specify what product it is. It just simply says it contains GM ingredients. And so if you have, almost every processed food has those in, they all have the label. How would that actually allow you to figure out if something caused you harm? Because it's probably not going to be GM foods generally. It'll be specific types of products. And there's no labeling for that anyhow, even under all the proposals for labeling. So you'd actually never actually be able to achieve what you want to do. One of the favorite arguments of the industry is, 1 trillion people have eaten this, no one's got sick. But how do you actually study that? Because we've all eaten it, right? I mean, so we could all be getting sick. And so, how do you actually tease that out and find it out is very difficult because you don't really have a control. Organic food is non-GM, but even people who try to eat a lot of organic food still will probably get some GM in other foods they eat and in some contaminated organic food. So it's very hard to actually have a control population of those who don't eat it. So it's hard to study in humans. It's also, as I said, very hard to study in animals. You can't get them to eat a whole bunch of GM food. So how do we study this? This is one of the huge problems and uncertainties. We don't have the same ways to study this that we do for a chemical or a pharmaceutical or something. So it's a real problem. Yeah, here and then here.
By choosing law over markets, don't you run the risk of forcing or at least duping people into consuming or participating in science or food that they don't think they want? I mean, other technologies have allowed us to analyze the risks and still accept to do it. More people are going to die driving cars, but we do it anyways.
Right.
That's our choice. Is it not fair to apply that same choice to GM foods?
So the question is basically, aren't we applying, are we sort of being unfair in GM foods and not allowing people to choose whether they have it or not by not labeling it? Is that sort of the...
Labeling or leaving it to the market in whatever form it takes.
Right.
I mean, shouldn't it be the company's job to convince us that this is better?
Right. And, market approaches, there's advocates of that. I mean, I think just leaving things to the market, we're not going to get the type of protection we need. That we need government oversight, government regulation. If we leave it to the markets, the incentive, I think, is, since most of the people producing these are profit-driven companies, will be not to disclose, not to study the risks, not to do the things we want them to do. And so I think there has to be intervention, and the way we intervene is through the legal system to force disclosure of risk, to force studies, to force some oversight. And so just leaving it to the market, I mean, you would think a responsible company would have an incentive not to hurt people because that's going to drive them off the market. But, it doesn't always work that way, as we've seen through history. Yes,
so it seems to me one of the features here is that we actually don't have any methods of testing food. Right? And so, because I suspect also most people don't appreciate that many of the foods that they're comfortable with actually have a fair load of toxins.
Right.
So is there anything out there where people are starting to look at ways to actually test foods that are not in the pharmaceutical model, but actually by components or something else that actually says you can label your rhubarb as having this much oxalic acid or something?
Yeah, so the question is, well, since we've never traditionally really been regulating foods for safety in this way by requiring testing, we don't really have the mechanisms. Is there a way to do this? And, I don't proclaim to have the expertise to answer this. Maybe people like Steve can answer it better. But there are some methods of first you can do chemical composition analysis. Doesn't tell you whether it's going to be toxic when you ingest it, but then you can test the ingredients in animals. The other things are things like toxicogenomics, of looking for early responses to in both humans and animals and plants and in cell systems to response to this in a much more effective way, subtle, sensitive, cheaper, quicker way than we've traditionally been doing of these 5-year cancer bioassays that take forever and cost $5 million. That there is these technologies, and I mean there's a lot of work going into how to do the risk assessment better. But I think that's something there needs to be a lot more work done on to be able to have any kind of certainty or confidence in the products. Yes, sir.
A lot of the problems in agriculture have to do with overproduction. How does GM fit into that? Does it benefit that, or does it exacerbate that? And who wins and loses with overproduction, and how does GM foods fit into that?
So the question is, one of the problems in the food industry right now is we have overproduction of foods, particularly in places like the United States. So how does GM affect that issue? Well, I mean, I think if you look globally, I think as we go forward the next 50 years, where we're going to have another 3 billion people, where a lot of our agricultural lands are becoming exhausted, especially in developing countries, we're not going to have an overabundance. We're actually going to have a severe shortage. And to be able to have a more efficient production of food is going to be very important. And GM is one of, I think, many different technologies that have to be pursued to try and achieve that. The other thing about GM is it allows you to produce more food per acre than many other types of food. Like organic, for example, you have to use much more land. And particularly in developing countries, again, where they're chopping down these tropical forests and that to create more space to grow foods to feed their population, something like GM that allow you to do it in a much more economic and efficient basis on a lower amount of land would provide benefits. So those would be the arguments in favor of GM foods affecting food supply. But the other argument is that somehow GM will be the single solution to our hunger problem. Something like 800 million people go to bed hungry every night, and I don't think GM, despite some of the more sort of egregious claims, will be the solution by itself to that. I think, as George McGovern says, it's part of the solution maybe, but there's many other things that have to be done, including how food's distributed, and economic issues are still going to be huge, even if we have GM foods. So, yes, sir.
Isn't it true that top agricultural officials have already acknowledged that the problem is not enough food, but a problem of distribution?
Right. I mean, so the question. The
issue of hunger is actually a red herring.
Right. Yeah, so the question isn't the main issue one of distribution? Yes, I mean, we have enough food to feed everybody today, and these 800 million people going hungry every night. If we could somehow distribute the food better, that would be a solution, but we're not doing that. And those 800 million people are hungry tonight, so we need additional things. And the problem is only going to get worse as we go forward, as I said, a lot of the lands in particularly developing countries are very loaded with salt now. The droughts are affecting them from global warming and other factors. Their productivity is peaking or going down. And as their populations continue to grow, we have over the next 50 years, a real crisis of getting enough food. It's not, and distribution is, again, a huge part of it. I'm not saying GM is the only solution, but I think it can be part of the solution if done right. Yes, ma'am?
I'm wondering how this works if, this biotech industry develops these GMOs for developing countries that are poor. How do they make their money on that? Then how does that help a developing country when they're, having to buy something that costs money, more money and resources to develop? I first don't get that model.
So the issue is how, if we develop these biotech products for developing countries, how are they going to afford them since they're more expensive? Well, one thing is that they could maybe be less expensive if you don't have to buy the expensive fertilizers and pesticides that you do for some other crops, particularly as your land, fertility goes down. But, we haven't seen a lot of investment by biotech companies in these developing country crops. They're developing crops for the markets who can pay for them, like us. And so that's why I think a lot of the hope for developing countries is not from huge multinational corporations, but from smaller academic, nonprofit research institutes, which tend to try and focus on developing crops for developing countries. And one of the problems we're creating by making it so expensive to develop one of these crops with so much regulatory red tape and costs is we're basically blocking those off. And so that's a real trade-off we have to be considering. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have some regulation, but we got to think of how much cost we're imposing on those non-corporate entities which don't have the money to be able to pay those costs. So right now we're sort of selecting out all these sort of humanitarian applications in favor of the large corporations. They're the ones who can afford to get a GM product approved. Yeah.
You mentioned patents on some of these GMOs. I know that one of the concerns of small farmers is patent infringement and that contamination of their own organic crop with a patented product. Is that a problem?
Yeah, then there's been so the question is on the issue of patents. There's been some concerns about farmers who are not growing GM foods finding the GM crop on their land and getting a possible liability for patent infringement. And there's been a number of those cases in the United States as well as some in Canada. And again, there's issues of how that came about, how that contamination came about. So far, every case that's gone to trial, the court has concluded that the farmer either deliberately or unintentionally planted the GM crop rather than having contamination through pollen and so on. But the legal theories that the courts have used would seemingly apply also if it was from pollen, cross-fertilization. We haven't had any case that's actually found that yet, but the theories and the language the courts have used would suggest that, which is what's causing the concern. So again, it's an area where there needs to be, I think, some clarification of what would be the cause of liability if you're growing GM crops without approval, because basically the licensing agreement for these GM crops don't allow you, for example, to collect the seeds at the end of the year and plant them again. You have to buy the seeds again the following year, and most of them are hybrid crops, so you do that anyhow. But if someone else takes those seeds and plants them, they're not only haven't paid for them, but it's a patent infringement, and that's a legal theory that Monsanto has brought over 50 of these cases in the United States is bringing against these farmers and saying you're infringing our patent by growing our crop without paying for it. And again, there's these huge factual disputes in each case. How did it happen? And so far the cases have been decided, the court has concluded that the farmer deliberately did plant the GM crop. Although the farmers have denied that, but the courts have found that as a factual matter. But it's disputed.
A couple more questions. I see one in the back.
Yes.
In listening to your presentation, you suggested working on a legal approach to some of the issues. And I'm wondering, in the case of an organization like the WTO, where they can basically trump law in different nations, what you see as sort of potential future conflict there in developing laws that can then be trumped by another organization that doesn't really belong to any country.
Right. So the question was about the WTO, which is this new thing that's only been around about 10 or 12 years now, to enforce world trade laws and basically trumping national laws and basically saying, we override your law. Your law is not supported, consistent with these world trade law principles. Well, I mean, I guess it's a very controversial area right now of world trade law because it applies a very hard standard. You basically have to have scientific evidence to put in place a restriction. And the reason for that is that a lot of countries have engaged in protectionist actions. And so at my lunch talk today, I was talking about how Netherlands banned Kellogg's Corn Flakes because the 19 essential vitamins could potentially harm someone. It turns out they have a domestic manufacturer of corn flakes that doesn't add the 19. And so they weren't really concerned about Kellogg's Corn Flakes hurting people. They wanted to use that alleged health reason to ban the Kellogg's company from coming in, the American company. And we have a long history of countries doing that. So every country that's subject to the WTO has agreed to apply by those rules. Now, it doesn't mean the rules shouldn't be changed or modified or softened to some extent, but you don't have to be a member of the WTO. But it basically comes back and bites everybody if you do apply protectionist activities. But it's still very troubling because it's saying, for example, that if citizens of France don't like GM foods for whatever reason, that's not legitimate unless they can show scientific studies to show it's harmful. And France's only recourse is to, okay, we won't be subject to the WTO. And that's their choice, but they're choosing to stay in it. What is happening in reality is that countries aren't complying with it. So, many years ago, the U.S. won a case against European restrictions on American beef. Europe stopped importing U.S. beef because we have hormones in our beef and they don't. Ironically, at the same time, they had mad cow disease. They probably would have been better off with our beef, probably. But they didn't know that at the time. But the World Trade Organization looked at that case and concluded there was no scientific basis for the Europeans to do that and held them in violation of world trade law. And the Europeans said, tough, we're still not complying with it. And so the U.S. is then allowed to put on what's called countervailing tariffs. So we put all these tariffs on French cheeses and other products coming into the country and make our citizens pay much more for European products, saying, that'll really hurt you. I guess it cuts down the sales of their products, but it really ends up punishing us. So there's no enforcement of these decisions. Countries can just choose to not comply with it, and then the only remedy is that the other country can put in countervailing restrictions. And so that's probably what's going to happen on the GMO thing as well. I think November 19th is the deadline, and several of the countries, including Austria, have said we're not going to comply. And so what does the U.S. do? All we can do is now restrict Australian imports, and we get into the same trade wars we had before WTO. So it's a real huge problem of how you deal with this in a world economy where different countries have different points of view. We have a long history of protectionism, but we also should recognize there's differences in countries. How you deal with that is a huge problem that I think needs more work.
Last question down here.
As a geneticist, what do you think the greatest present liability is of GMs, and do you think that the legal system is capable of responding in a timely manner to that?
Well, since I haven't done genetics in 20 years, I really can't proclaim myself as a geneticist. I'm a former geneticist. I'm a lawyer now. But the question was, what is the greatest potential liability? And I think that the big issue is this issue of cross-contamination or pollen drift. I mean, is that a harm? Should that be a legal harm? Should that be something, for example, when crops contaminate another crop and you get these multi-million-dollar economic costs to clean this up? Is that a real harm? And right now our legal system is sort of inconsistent. We have different opinions in different courts. Some courts have said that's not a problem. The one I talked to you about, the USDA one, said it is. And to me, it's a very difficult problem with different legitimacy arguments on both sides. And how we resolve that question, I think, is going to be a really fundamental key issue. And it's right now very different depending which court and judge you get. So to me, that's the biggest issue, because the reality is plants always spew out their pollen to other plants. Up until now, it hasn't really mattered, but now, from a legal perspective, it might, and from an economic perspective, it might, but maybe not from a health and environmental perspective.